Well, benedicite Dominus, and welcome to question 112 of the Summa Theologica, of the secundae. The topic for this lecture is apostasy, and I am Dr. Thibault. As we've been going through the vices attributed to faith, we are now on to apostasy, question 12. If you're interested in these other topics, go ahead and click on those as well. This one's a very short section, only 2 articles, and the articles are fairly straightforward, so it won't be a very long one, so apologize for anyone who wants a long talk about apostasy. The first question, just like with heresy, is apostasy unbelief? Now, if we, I think the answer to this is very interesting. Easy to say yes, but I think St. Thomas's answer is interesting. So there's several unions between God and man which exist, right? So the first and most basic is that man is united to God in faith, right? So that is the most basic union between God and man. But then there are also other unions, by man obeying the commandments. That's a union, that's a covenantal relationship. And also through religious life or holy orders. These are also, vows we take to God. Therefore, they have a binding effect to create a different type of communion. So a married couple has a different union with God than a religious sister or a priest, right? There's not, they're different, right? They're different. So now, if a person leaves religious life, they do not become an apostate, right? They may have vowed to God poverty, chastity, and obedience. You leave through the proper forms and you get married. You still have that vow you made to God of poverty, chastity, and obedience. So are you now an apostate to the faith? Have you fallen away from the faith? Well, no, you haven't fallen away from the faith necessarily, just because you have left religious life, presuming you're doing it through the proper channels and for the right reasons. But you don't lose faith in God, right? It's a breaking of a vow, but it's not. You have not become God's enemy by doing so, right? Same thing with a priest who leaves. Right? This isn't something that's great. It's not something, but if you stop being a priest through the proper channels, you don't cease to be Catholic, right? You are now have no faculties and you function as a layman within the church, but it does not mean that you can no longer be Catholic. Well, that makes sense. How about when obeying the commandments? What if you cease to obey the commandments? Well, everyone who sins doesn't obey some commandment. So, particularly with mortal sin. But we don't call everyone who sins an apostate. It's not, I coveted my neighbor's wife, now I'm an apostate. No, you're a sinner, right? You'd be under mortal sin. But it doesn't mean that you have become fallen away from the faith, right? You still could say, well, I believe in the creed. I believe in this. I didn't make the right decision, right? And I'm guilty of that. But it doesn't mean you're no longer a Catholic because you have sinned, right? Otherwise, there would be no Catholics if all you had to do was sin and you're no longer a Catholic, right? We don't go around calling people apostates because they've sinned. We call them sinners, right? If you sinned, you're a sinner. You're not an apostate. But now if you've fallen away from the faith, right? You have said, I do not believe the faith, or some important article of the faith. You don't believe the dogma of the church, some element of the dogma. This is called the apostasy of perfidy, St. Thomas calls it. This is a walking away from the faith. It's like a lie. It's a deception. It's an abandonment of the faith, right? So if you've walked away from the faith itself, now that's an apostasy. So again, we don't call people who've sinned apostates or people who have broken a vow apostates, but those who have abandoned the faith, then they are an apostate. So in that regard, if you say, well, I used to believe, but now I no longer believe, right? I don't believe the faith. Well, that is unbelief, right? So that's apostasy is then unbelief. The second and last article in this section, question 12, is if a prince becomes an apostate, do they forfeit their dominion? Do they forfeit the right to have the Catholic citizens obey them, right? Recognize them? And St. Thomas points out that once the communication takes place, all oaths to the king or the prince or the leader is absolved, right? So once excommunicated, all duties are off, right? You should not, because excommunication would be not even talking to the person. Certainly shouldn't be bolstering their reign. Hopefully then that puts the pressure on the prince to no longer be an apostate and to return, right? That's the goal, right? If all the citizens rebel and say, no, we're not going to follow you, you have become an apostate, or other sins could do this too, right? Killing your brother and stealing his wife, or for example, like Herod, right? You could get, you could get the citizenry to rise up, and then it would be for the salvation of the prince's soul, right? Because the soul then turns back to the faith, and then it could lead to his salvation, right? So that's for the sake of everyone. Why also shouldn't Catholic citizenry follow an apostate prince? Well, because they had the faith and now they have rebelled against it. So their mindset, their mental disposition is against the faith. So since it's the job of the prince to establish laws and principles and an attitude of the people, well, if his attitude is rebellion against God and the church, then he's going to lead the souls of his people astray, right? That's not good. St. Thomas does point out, though, that when you are a prince, you are primarily in the duty of human law, right? In some sense, that remains, right? There's some element of the human law. It's not your primary point of being a prince is not the divine law, but the human law. Because of that, let's say a prince, by prince I just mean any ruler, is not an apostate. They just never were a believer, right? Let's say missionaries go to China, and one of the leaders of the Chinese government, right? Maybe not the communist government. They, 100 and something years ago, right? You go to China, right? And missionaries are going there. Well, they're not Christian there, right? That's why there's missionaries going there. Do you not have to follow the leader in China? Well, no. You should follow the leader in China. The leader in China is not an apostate. He's a pagan or a heathen, using St. Thomas's language, right? He's never been converted. So he actually is not rebelling against the faith. He's unaware of the faith, right? So that's a different thing to be not a member of the faith compared to rebelling against the faith. Now, if he creates any laws that are contrary to the divine law, you don't have to be obedient to it, because your primary obedience is to divine law over human law. So if a human law contradicts divine law, you can rebel against it, but otherwise the natural law, right, the human law established by the ruler can last, presuming that the person is not an apostate. Again, if they are an apostate, there's a bit of a presumption that their rebellion, right, if they go as far as becoming an apostate, they might have a real axe to grind against God and the church, in which case, who knows what they'll be leading you astray with. I guess if we want to expand this further, since we don't really have Catholic nations anymore, not many, maybe we can look at this in terms of corporations or families or other authorities. That could be a possibility too. What if the father of the household who is to be obeyed becomes a Mormon, for example? Does that mean you have to obey him in that regard? Well, No, he's become an apostate. So should there be some rebellion against it? These are gray areas, but in principle, then, yeah, there should be pushback of people in higher authority who have become apostates, right? That's the general principle, and we should not support them, and we have to be careful that their axe to grind isn't passed on to us that risks our own souls, right? So that's kind of it in a nutshell. So lastly, in conclusion, apostates are apostasy is a form of unbelief, and apostate princes or leaders are not to be obeyed, and it's for the sake of encouraging them to return to the faith and not to lead your own soul astray. So that's it in a nutshell, and we'll be moving forward, finishing faith before you know it, in the blink of an eye.